Okay, I'm very happy to be able to invite the people to the stage for our next panel. When we were discussing, what we wanted to do with this event, this might have been the first thing the first panel that we actually came up with, and FLYBOY Unbound: The Life and Significance of Greg Tate. So that panel will be moderated by Syreeta Gates. Syreeta, you can come up. Nelson George. The great Joan Morgan has just joined us. And her childhood neighbor, Mark Anthony Neal, is here. Bestie, did y'all live in the same building or something? First floor and fifth floor, right. There's kind of your footnote details there. And so, is Rashid here? Oh, Rashid's downstairs. Okay, so we have a few things just as a preface to this panel. It's very, Liz, come up, thank you. So, one thing that I've thought a lot about in this position is institutionalization and what institutions are supposed to do. And we have often felt, the reason that we had this entire conference is that we felt that the contributions of hip-hop journalists had not been recognized by the institutions of mainstream journalism, not to the extent that they should be. And we thought that there was no instance more egregious than the genius and brilliance of Greg Tate. And so we thought we needed to have a panel about this. And Rashid is downstairs. We'll wait for him to come up to join for this. But we were also thinking about how you do something that's institutional. And there are a lot of things that should be done. We could just do a poll here to say, if you raise your hand if you were in some way influenced by Greg Tate's work. And the other half of the other 10% of people who weren't, it's you either were through someone else or you will be. His work is that significant. Okay, Rashid is here. And so, and as I stall for the 10 seconds or 5 seconds it will take for him to get to the stage before I say what we're saying, we got into a conversation about what we could do that was institutional. And so we're happy to announce the creation of the Greg Tate Scholarship at Columbia Journalism School. This was equally funded through Columbia Journalism School and Critical Minded. And we have raised the money that it will take to give a $10,000 scholarship to a student interested in arts, journalism, and or criticism for the next 5 years. And we welcome you to join in with this. Wait, did I leave something out? Oh. So we welcome you to join in with this. We have a QR code, which we couldn't put up here, but we have it posted in the back here. And I'm actually going to pass this around. We have a QR code. If you are interested in contributing to the scholarship fund, you can do so through here as well. And this was our small part to make a corrective to the egregious oversight of this man's influence and creative brilliance and the work that he's contributed and continues to contribute to us understanding our culture and our world and our place in it. Rashid.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I won't say much more than what Jelani has said, except that for everyone who knew Greg Tate and everyone who was immersed in his writing and I shared earlier today, just the influence he was for me as a writer, and why I'm standing here, I would say, has a lot to do with the imagination, the creativity of Greg Tate, not just the writer, but the artist, the visionary, and he tutored so many of us in this room. And so when he passed, the immediate thought was, who's got to fill a void that will not be filled? But also, most importantly, we need to remember him consistently onward in his memory. And by doing that was this scholarship for us. This isn't the only one that will be done, hopefully, but this was one that we were thankful to Brian and the entire family for acknowledging, allowing us space to lift him up today, for all of us who loved him and loves hip hop. And Greg was not just a hip hop journalist, that's where he was wedded, but he documented the culture, and I mean Black culture, and he was just so prolific that it's just so much that we can say. So I will not continue, but what I will say just that I'm thankful to Elizabeth again, to my colleagues at Critical Minded, the board, for allowing us to put resources into this recognition of Greg, and that obviously Columbia Journalism School, we're honored to partner with Jelani and everyone here. So thank you all, and thank you to the family especially for allowing us to lift up Greg in this way. Thank you.
And so we're fortunate to have some of Greg's loved ones with us today. If you could please stand up and we can acknowledge you. And okay, Syreeta, the floor is yours.
My mic sounds nice. Check one. Nah. First things first. First thing we gonna do is get this energy right. First, I'd like to say thank you, for you all could have been anywhere in the world, but you're rocking with us. We are talking about the late, great Greg Tate. Y'all clap it up one time. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Come on, energy. You're going to have to laugh to keep from crying. So we're going to keep this going the whole hour, just so y'all know. Get your hands ready. My name is Syreeta Gates. I'm an artist. I'm an archivist because of the genius of people who wrote about hip-hop journalism. I have archived and documented over 150 writers, which I'm grateful that they had the opportunity to tell me their stories. And when I was in my young money 20s, I met this guy named Greg, who I probably called him one time, and Tate essentially threw me in the ocean before I knew I could swim. I see a lot of head nods. Yeah, he was throwing a lot of us in oceans before we knew we can swim. But it's because of Tate that I have been doing this work for over a decade around hip-hop journalism, which will lead to a book and a documentary. Thank you. LOL. But to my left, whew, child. Mr. Nelson George, Brooklyn, born, bred, and because the talent of these geniuses to my left is so extensive, I'm not even gonna go through the broad resumes. We talking about Grammy nominated folks, NAACP award folks, we talking about Emmy, I mean, the list, the books written, my God, like, grab a Snicker, we could literally be here all day. But first things first, Nelson George, born and bred, gave us, him along with Rocky Ford, gave us the first piece of hip-hop journalism when it was called B Beats. I know some of y'all was outside for that. And the work he's done, I mean, just in relation to hip-hop, we're not even going to talk about Black music culture, period. It's just substantial. So we first have Nelson George. Then to his left, we have Bronx own. Anybody from the Bronx in the town? Okay, I ain't really see no X's. We gonna have to get that together. All right, we got Miss Joan Morgan. If you've ever heard the term hip-hop feminism, we can all say thank you. And later, she had the audacity to step it up even another level. Now we have to call her Miss Doctor Throw some respect on it. Dr. Joan Morgan, you dig, who's been at NYU doing all the magical things. And lastly, to her left, again, Bronx own. The Bronx is, I'm from Southside Jamaica, Queens. I make sure it's always known. But the Bronx is definitely in the house. Shout out to y'all one time. Brooklyn, you probably never felt like this before, huh, Nelly? Brooklyn is definitely in the house. Brooklyn is definitely in the house. But Professor Mark Anthony Neal, again, Joan's best friend, let's just say that. You probably never got introduced like that before one time for the one time. Wow, come on. Finish my whole situation. No. But professor of Black popular culture in the Department of African American Studies at Duke University, giving us all the books on Black culture, specifically around the archive, which was his latest book. And we're going to chop it up. Y'all ready to go? Ready. Oh, and last but not least, we got the incomparable, Detroit's own, Fresh Get the Money, Dreamy Fresh Get the Money, who's given us, so many profiles on your favorite rappers, because honestly, if you look at the panel we have gathered here today, these are your favorite rappers. Let's be very clear. So we have Mark Anthony Neal, Dreamy Fresh, Dream Hampton, Joan Morgan, Nelson George. And before I get into my spiel, I'd like to also shout out Michael Gonzalez, who is not able to be on this panel today. But if you know anything about Gregory Iron Man Tate and Michael Gonzalez, you know Mike has been spreading a good word about Tate for a long time. For those that don't know, I'm always clear, get your Googles on. Now is the time to bring out your phone. Greg Tate is a self-proclaimed reporter, a brother, a connector of people and worlds, holder of court on Astor Street, a beauty seeker of Black folks, sushi eater, a son, co-founder of the Black Rock Coalition, musician, author, cultural critic, bison, Afrofuturist. He's never been a part of this world. Professor, founder of Burnt Sugar Orchestra, dad, a recommender of Blues People by Mary Baraka, every time, all the time and often, and a granddad. And before I get started, I wanted to read this piece that Toni Morrison wrote about Jimmy Baldwin, because this is precisely how I feel, and I'm sure a lot of you feel about Tate's work. Well, the season was always Christmas with you there, and like one aspect of that scenario, you did not neglect to bring at least 3 gifts. You gave me a language to dwell in, a gift so perfect it seemed my own invention. I have been thinking your spoken and written thoughts for so long, I believe they were mine. I have been seeing the world through your eyes for so long, I believe that clear view was my own. Even now, even here, I need you to tell me what I am feeling and how to articulate it. So I have poured again through the 6,895 pages of your published work to acknowledge the debt and thank you for the credit. No one possessed or inhabited language for me the way that you did. You made American English honest, genuinely international. Whew. And so with that said, can you all please share one moment, and I know you've all had thousands and thousands of moments with Tate, but share one moment with Tate as it relates to his writing. As Charles Mingus says, how did it hit you in the soul? So specifically, we're gonna start with you, Nelson. Talk to me about Tate as it relates to his writing, and then I have personal questions for you all.
Well, I started writing for the Village Voice in 1981. And I believe that's Greg's first year writing there as well.
Yeah.
So I'm in there and I'm looking at this guy, Greg Iron Man Tate. I'm like, Iron Man? Whoa, what the, that's pretty bold. I was like, whoa. And then I read the prose. And it was psychedelic, it was rhythmic, it was surreal, it was Black, it was all these different things. And I'm like, I gotta write in the same columns as this guy? It's pretty intimidating. There was also Stanley Crouch in there. There was Lester Bangs. There was a lot of bangers in there who were spraying. So I always visioned this Iron Man guy was some 70s bohemian, you know, some kind of, he maybe dropped acid back in, you know, in San Francisco back in the day. And so one day in the office, I meet Greg. And I think, oh, he should be the late night guy at HUR. He's got this voice. It sounds like a voice made for radio. It's beautiful. He's very relaxed and, now I wouldn't say humble, but because he's super smart. But the prose was like this kind of cosmic thing, and he was a very normal guy. And I kept thinking, inside this man's head, there are miles and miles and miles of information. And I always think that good criticism is basically putting out a philosophy, right? Any good critic has a sense of what quality is, what excellence is, and the writing then comes down. Once you know their voice, you understand their standard of quality. And Greg's sense of reference from Electric Miles, Sun Ra, Sam Delaney, Octavia Butler, it was a very diverse, Frank Zappa, you know, a very diverse world of references that he distilled down into a philosophy of quality. And I just always thought that that was, in his writing, you immediately were engaged with this sense of purpose. That he had a great sense of, okay, I've seen all this, I've read all this, now I'm distilling it through my prose, and I'm advocating for a way of looking at the world. I guess what we'd call now Afrofuturism, right? But before that had a word, he was already articulating a vision that was very precise. And I think that's what, when I first engaged and met him at The Voice and read his writing, that's what I felt like. This is a writer who has a voice and also has a vision. And that really struck me.
Thank you. Joan?
My answer to this is always really different than other people's, because when I met Greg, I had no idea who he was. Okay. Y'all can hear me? Yeah. All right. When I met Greg, I didn't know who he was. And I certainly hadn't read him. I wasn't reading The Village Voice. I was straight out the boogie. I accompanied my cousin to a party where her boyfriend at the time was a lawyer for this band called Living Color. And I remember that Mick Jagger walked in, and I was like, oh, I don't know what this is, and I don't know what kind of artist I can be. But if Mick Jagger rolls up in the spot with these dudes, these cats, that's where I want to be. And there was this kind of shy guy there. And I don't remember how we started talking, and I didn't know he was a writer, and I didn't know what The Village Voice was. So I never came to Greg as a fan beforehand. I started reading, the first thing he had me read of his was a music review. I don't remember the band. I do remember not understanding what in the world he was talking about. And I also didn't know them because, again, coming from the boogie and the way that we engaged hip hop was not through music reviews. I didn't know people really paid attention to music reviews as a way to determine how you buy music. But I kept reading. Again, I mean, this is well documented, but Greg is my ex. He's not my mentor, right? So, and later my friend. And somewhere in that, in the course of a relationship, you figure you should read the person that you are in a relationship, right? Maybe. And I had just started to write at The Voice. And so there are two moments that I remember really well, is the Public Enemy piece and the Michael Jackson piece. And Tate says, he wrote some shit about Michael. I was like, ooh, the blacks are gonna be mad at you. And they were. And Public Enemy, he was loving and critical. And in that moment, I learned you can do that. And that actually black criticism is the highest form of love for the art that we produce. And it has never, ever left me. And I don't think Chickenheads would be what it could be if I hadn't figured that out in that moment, in that state.
Thank you, Joan. Yep, clap it up one time.
Joan mentioned growing up in the boogie, and my parents sent me to a 7-day Adventist school from grades 1 to 8. They themselves spent a lot of time listening to Aretha, Owl, the Mighty Clouds of Joy, and Shirley Caesar. So it was a really specific kind of archive and experience that I'm dealing with. And then I went to Brooklyn Tech. Bus and 2 trains every day, 4 hours, 3 to 4 hours of train travel. And the only reason why I started reading The Voice, because I needed some shit to read on these trains every day. And I started really reading The Voice over and over again because one of the names I did know, because I had read Billboard, was Nelson. So I was like, okay, because, you know, where we came from, the Village Voice was some magazine with some weird shit in it, right? And 100 pages of weird ads, right? You know, and those y'all who remember that Village Voice, right? Shit you couldn't show your parents, like if you brought the Voice in the house, because they'd be like, what are you doing?
Classifieds was a problem.
For real. So I started reading Greg and Nelson, and Lisa Jones would show up, and a bunch of folks, and eventually Joan. But the piece that I remember is a piece called Diary of a Bug, 17 fragments. And he's dropping references to French existentialists. He's talking about Rakim, you know, am I eternal, am I eternalist? Raising this whole question about the archive and longevity. And I'm like, I want to not just write like that, because I knew I couldn't. I wanted to know how to think like that. And I always felt that part of Greg's genius was that he would use music or some sort of cultural artifact to talk about so much more, right? To really take that as a ground base of something else. Go forward, you know, almost 30 years, and I'm on the Duke University Press Advisory Board, right? And we're looking at all these manuscripts. I did that for 6 years, of books that were going to be published by Duke University Press, and Greg sought out, you know, my friend Ken Wissaker to publish his updated FLYBOY, right? And I remember being in the room then at that moment because no one else around the table knew who the hell Greg Tate was. And it was like I had an opportunity to witness for someone who had been so critical to the way that I talked about culture and thought about culture and made the kind of connections I've been able to do in my writing throughout my career. And that was just all about Tate being Tate.
Thank you, Mark. Dream?
Yes, thank you. I made my profile picture on Zoom Tate so that when I'm not on camera, it's not just like me from 1984 looming down on y'all. 1984, the Orwellian reference. I met Tate with Joan. I guess it was the New Music Seminar. I had just published my first thing in The Source, which was an essay calling Dr. Dre a bitch for attacking Dee Barnes. And he and Joan came up to me and introduced themselves and kind of welcomed me into this world that I didn't even know existed. And the next thing you know, I was writing for the Village Voice, where I went further in on NWA. I reviewed their second album, Niggas for Life. Anyway, like Joan, I consider him a friend more than a mentor. I often thought of his work as so dense, like I'm still years later, like making my way through it. I used to tease him about how dated his slang would be or had become, and now that's me. Like I look back at some of my articles and I'm like, arg. But to Nelson's point about pulling in different references, and I know we'll get to his work later, but I'm looking at a Rakim piece that he wrote, and it's really, he's comparing him to Miles, which if you knew Tate, you know that's a part of a triumvirate for him that includes Baraka, Miles, and Jimi Hendrix, with the little Samuel Delaney. And and how sacred that was for him to not only pull in Miles Davis, but there's one graph that pulls in Miles Davis, Al Green, Yoshi Yamamoto. And that really was, like, before we had computers that had 30 tabs open, that's kind of how Tate's brain worked, you know? He has many tabs open all the time. And, you know, his generosity, I haven't known anything like it since, you know? I try to pass on, just like he walked me into, you know, The Voice and introduced me to Chris Gow and Joe Levy. I try to create those opportunities when I can for other folks, but for Tate, I don't know, I miss him so much still. There was a beautiful piece that came out, and I say beautiful in kind of what Joan is saying, like it's rigorous criticism of the film American Fiction. I was sharing it, the share online went kind of viral for a second, and I texted it to Tate. I don't know who has Tate's number now, but they get random Tate's texts from me to this day. It's something that he would have loved. I reached, the author saw that I was sharing it. He followed me back and DM'd me. And I said to him, you know, Greg Tate would have loved this. And he said, oh, I went to school with Shannara, the author's Jason England. And I once met Tate in Iowa, probably at that writer's workshop they do there. And I got to talk to Tate for an hour. And I used to be frustrated in the way that you want your friends to produce things, like the novel that we never got from Tate, or I look at Nelson and all the books he's produced, like the many books that we didn't get from Tate, but Tate spent his life and his time and his treasure in community, like on the phone, not just with AJ, although AJ takes up a good 6 or 7 hours of the day, but like with so many of us, just always like talking to us, and that's how he spent his life, and that's like so much a part of his legacy, is the time he spent with us being in conversation. So I'll end it there.
Thank you, Fresh.
Yes.
Y'all can clap it up. It's fine. It's cool. We in good company here. We in good company here. And I think to Dream's point and just the panelist's point, yes, we can talk about Tate as a writer, but it is because of who he was and is as a human that made the writing so much more jiggy. You know what I'm saying? It was so expansive and completely blew your mind, and he would write New York, YAWK, and if you like, am I spelling it wrong? Is he like, I'm not really sure. And so inside of who Tate is as a person, Nelson, talk to me a little bit about Tate and Stanley Crouch's relationship.
Well, you know, the Village Voice Writers Room was a very amazing place. And they had the spot when they went 13th and Broadway. There was a room when you came in that was off the main door. That was kind of like, there were some telephones and some desks.
It wasn't the smoking room?
I didn't smoke, so.
Wait, but I think it was the smoking room, and none of us smoked. I had quite cancer to be in there.
We give thanks.
And so in this room, you'd see Joan or Harry Allen when he started writing, obviously Greg, and then Stanley would roll through every now and then. Now, Stanley, you know, as I think someone said earlier today, a lot of stuff that Stanley said is oppositional to what hip hop is, but he was a brilliant writer and thinker, and he loved to argue. He loved to debate. So he would just come into the room to like cause trouble. You're like, you know, who can I fuck with today? And, but I thought it was interesting because, you know, Stanley was a bully. He was a bully. But Tate and him had a ring because he had to respect Tate. And what's really interesting is that you look at Miles Davis, the two of them had the exact opposite attitude toward Miles Davis. You know, Greg was a champion of everything electric. Miles is a champion, you know, Stanley, everything before electric. And you would think that Tate would, you think that Stanley would go at Greg, but he respected the prose. He respected the voice and the vision. So of all the people in the, he never fucked with Greg. Because he knew Greg could stand up to him, and knew as much as he did. Because the thing about Greg that was so great, yes, he knew the electric stuff, but he also knew the acoustic stuff. And where Stanley would like to get you is he figured you wouldn't know as much as he did. But Greg could stand toe-to-toe with him. And that was really an amazing thing because if you, again, The Voice was a place of literally voices. And Stanley had, I won't make it a Stanley Crouch thing, but he was a really good prose writer. And the thing about The Voice that was so important was not to equivocate. It was not a place where you went, perhaps he should. No, you say, he should. There was no equivocation in that place. And Greg's writing was so precise and evocative that Stanley, who was a real literary snob, because it's all about Ellison, it's all about Albert Murray. If you haven't read Albert Murray, you should. That he knew that Greg was in that ballpark. So that was just interesting because of the nature of that place, which was very combative anyway.
Indeed, thank you, Nelson. Mark, the summer of 1992, you bought your first Bell Hooks book. There was a companion piece to said book. Can you talk to me a little bit about why you got that?
It was my first year anniversary. My wife and I had driven from Western New York, where I was in grad school at the University of Buffalo, to Toronto, for a weekend. And there was this great independent bookstore. And I bought two things there. I bought Bell Hooks' Yearning, and I bought FLYBOY and the Buttermilk. And, ironic, given the times of their departure, right? Those books both were kind of on boards for me. FLYBOY and the Buttermilk was important because, I had read many of Greg's essays in The Voice, but there were pieces that I hadn't seen before, right? So it was great to have it collected. I still have my original copy of it. And now, we have nice little pens and we write, but I use a highlighter, right? I can remember all the pieces that I highlighted and all the stuff that I read because he wrote about it. Like David Levering Lewis's When Harlem Was in Vogue, right? That was something I got introduced to reading Greg's book, but the thing that always stayed with me about that book was Skip Gates's Forward, right? And again, they're living in two very, very different worlds. This Skip Gates now running Harvard Black Studies program. He had just published the groundbreaking Signifying Monkey. When I was in grad school and playing with my writing, I had an older advisor who went to grad school with Otto Rampersad. So he sent Rampersad a bunch of my samples of my writing, and Rampersad wrote back, yeah, this is all nice, but it's very Village Voicey, very journalist-like, kind of like Greg Tate, right? Which for me was a badge of honor, but it also meant it would mean some challenges going into academia. But anyway, reading Skip's Forward, and the last lines are, I don't agree with all of this, I don't understand all of this, but keep this nigga boy writing. That always stayed with me, right? One, because writers write, right? And you can't be fearful of the craft, you can't be fearful of what the recognition is. You can never be over concerned about the eyeballs. Because the thing that we forget about Tate, we hear all this time, who's gonna fill the void? The context that created Tate doesn't exist anymore. This is someone who got a national reputation writing for an independent newspaper in New York City, right? It would be, not really until he starts writing that first piece in Vibe do we even think about Greg Tate having kind of a national following. So how does someone writing for an independent newspaper in print, right, which you can only mainly get in New York, it had some distribution, how does someone like that influence generations of people 40 years later? So that's the thing that sticks in, and part of it was that book, right? So many people go back to that book and it's like, wow, this is really, right? I saw a black man writing from a black feminist perspective in that book, which is something that I wasn't seeing. I always think it's limiting to think about Greg as a hip hop journalist, right? Because that's not really what he was doing, right? Because he was as attuned to hip hop as he was funk, jazz, right? And a range of other kind of forms of music. I think about the piece that he did on Mark Anthony Nelson, right? When nobody was paying attention, to his work, right?
Anthony Thompson?
Mark Anthony Thompson, thank you. Right, when no one was
Absolute
paying
genius.
attention, right, who's now a whole nother kind of entity, right? But I got introduced to that work because Greg decided to spend some space, and that's the other thing that I learned about that book. It's easy to write about the stars. It's easier to write about the people that are popping on the top charts because, editors will say, you'll write a piece. It's about writing about those folks who are off the beaten path. Right, and feeling as though you're actually doing some work contributing to the culture by bringing into the mainstream of the mix of the culture folks that folks weren't paying attention to.
I just want to mention the Bad Brains article he did in '82, because now it's taken for granted. Well, the Bad Brains, yeah. In 1982, that was some radical shit. People didn't know who the Bad Brains were, because they were a black hardcore band. No black people knew who they were. I'll tell you that. And the fact is that was a celebration of an aesthetic that Greg was drawn to, and that he was helping define. He would ultimately help define, not just with his writing, but through his own musical choices.
For sure, no question. And one thing I would definitely say about Tate, the way I don't know if he was intentional about it or just because that's who he was, the way he championed black women in particular, like unparalleled, right? So Joan, talk to me a little bit about, and I know you've told this story before, but it's a new audience. Again, people, do your Googles if you don't know. Joan was not trying to be a writer. Like, imagine if we didn't get Chickenheads. The audacity of you. Like, you know what I mean? Joan, talk to me a little bit about, one, you not wanting to write by any means, but two, how your relationship with Tate at that point led you to create a phrase that would later give context for, like, millennia.
Okay, so I'm going to start with a little story and back into your question about something I've been dying to say since I got the invitation to be here. Many decades ago, I had been invited to Columbia Journalism School to give a talk. And in the during the talk, I don't remember the question, but it was something about how I did something based on what I learned at journalism school. And I didn't go to journalism school. And the silence that like fell over that room, and this follow-up question was, again, how I learned to do how did I learn to develop my voice? What mentors I guess I had in journalism school. And I said, I didn't know the rules, so I really wasn't scared to break them. And I actually don't think I could have developed the voice that I had if I had gone to journalism school, because I didn't really need to learn the who, what, where, when, and why. I had people around me, like Tate, like Nelson, like Barry Michael Cooper, Scott Polson, Bryan. I would say my first profile, I got assigned a profile on Moni Love. I didn't know what the fuck a profile was. I was like, Scott, I don't know what a profile is, but I said yes. And he said, all you got to do is know your lead. Just think about opening up like a great scene from a movie. And I have held on to that ever since. So I went to graduate school, but I always say my original cohort is this group of writers that I came up with. And I knew at that moment, when I heard that Paul fall over the audience at Columbia Journalism School, I was like, they are never inviting me back up in this bitch. The fact that I'm like invited back up in this bitch is all Greg Tate.
Yes, all Tate.
Is all Tate. Because Greg's unofficial title is A&R for the Village Voice. When we think about the void that is left, I think Greg had been filling that void and preparing to have that void filled the whole time. That Greg was, and a lot of that attention fell to women that he felt had a particular talent. I had no interest in writing whatsoever. I thought I was on my way to the screen, the big screen. Barry Michael Cooper can tell you about the time I auditioned for New Jack City. But Tate felt that I should keep writing. And I didn't enjoy it. Like, honestly, I was like, this is really hard. And if I wanted like hard, like could I at least do profitable? Like law school started to see like, I like nice things. But I kept writing. And one of the reasons that I was able to keep writing was Tate always encouraged me to not, that the magic was in what I didn't know, and not to be afraid to lean into what I didn't know. Tate taught me that if a piece wasn't working in what I thought was like a standard structure, to fuck with the structure, which is why the Ice Cube piece I wrote continues to be the most republished piece internationally more than 30 years later, because I couldn't get it out the normal way. I was like, Greg, it's just coming to me in like snatches. He said, write snatches. Tate was like that. He was just I've never met someone so generous in not just finding talent and helping to find, like, when people say they wanted to write just like Tate, that just like blows me away, because I think Dream could say that. Like, it's the last thing he would have wanted you to do. He wanted you to find your own voice and your own center, and that was the thing that he championed, was for you to become the most of you. And I cannot think of a greater gift to any of us. And it's not just that I wouldn't have become a writer if it wasn't for Tate, because it really was his idea. It was not mine. I think I was published for like 2 years before I was like, okay, I could do this. And not because I was insecure. Again, I just didn't really like it like that much. I was like, there's a lot of pressure, these deadlines and turning things over. I like the camaraderie, but the actual work, I don't know. I kind of still feel that way, so like, don't judge me. But I will say, Tate was just a living example of what it meant to be free and an artist. And
wait, I'm sorry. Say that one more time for the people in the back of the back.
Tate was a living, breathing example of what it meant to be free and black and an artist. And so none of us consider ourselves hip-hop journalists, and that's because of Tate, because we learned to be writers. The hip-hop journalist thing was the thing that helped everybody else out there make sense of who we were, coming with this furiosity and ferociousness and this claim to what we thought was ours and we were gonna put a stamp on. I remember telling Nelson George that I was teaching a hip-hop journalism class many years ago, I think it was 91, at the New School, and he said, you really let them talk you into giving you a job doing that. That is not a thing. That is not a thing. Here we are, many, many years later, sir, it was most certainly a thing. But I think that Tate really encouraged you to be free. And I don't think that there are that many people who are brave enough to do that for themselves. And you know, Tate made choices like Dream. It's like, oh, won't you write more books? Or you worried about his, like, yo, you get up there in age, like, you know, don't you want a steady job? Like that kind of thing. But those were never his fears. And because of that, we all benefited in such beautiful ways. And I think I'll say this because I'm a person that moves very much in spirit, and those of you who know me well know this. When Tate died, I was heartbroken. This panel I can do now without breaking out in tears. I couldn't do that for the first one. Like, I felt like my heart, my history, such a critical part of myself was just gone. But I also felt not many days after that he was really gone. Like, I didn't feel like he was lingering in this plane. He was gone. And I think he was gone, and it gave me comfort that he wasn't like in limbo, because he had done what he came here to do. And the rest of it was on us. And I hold on to that when I miss him every day.
Thank you for that, Joan. Dreamy Fresh, I'm going to have you start this question and then lead into our panelists, and then we're going to wrap it up. Many days over sushi that you and Tate have had. What does the culture gain because of what Tate left behind?
I'm glad you brought up sushi.
Yes.
Tate was my sushi husband. One of the deep heartbreaks in your intro, Syreeta, you talked about him being, you talked about his office on Astor Place, and those who knew Tate knew that in at least 3 seasons, he would be posted up next to what I hope is still the barbershop there on Astor Place. But the other spot, when he wasn't in Harlem, was Shiraku, this sushi spot that me, him, and Shannara, me, him, and whoever, I'm sure that the owners thought we were a couple, because he was literally my sushi husband. This was a six-day-a-week habit. He actually introduced me to eating sushi at that place. And I think about, again, just continuing this theme around his generosity, the way that he shouted people out, even his bands, you talk about him as an artist, before there was the Burnt Sugar Orchestra, to Mark's point about him being this man who was a Black feminist, he formed the band Women in Love with Helga Davis, who now has that incredible podcast. It's not like it was only women, that I think of Micah Gow, I think of the twins, Danny and Daniel. I think of just what the Black Rock Coalition made possible, what he and Vernon and Conda did by creating a little bit of organization, not too much, because folks still needed to be funky and free and radical and rock stars, but it created sometimes I believe funds for struggling Black musicians. But his legacy is in what all of us are going to go on to do. And even those, not yet born, he's going to be in the canon forever. His generosity is evidenced through all of us, right? I've never seen anyone be better at citation, which I look at as a Black feminist principle also. Black women are constantly having to cite one another because there is systemic erasure, right? And Tate was the king of that, always lifting up his friends, calling them what they are. I'm looking at a piece that he wrote in 1998 when he called Amani Wilson, writer Amani Wilson. If you know Amani Wilson, you know that she's many things, an editor, a scholar. But he was writer Amani Wilson, He affirmed me as a filmmaker from my earliest days. Like Joan, I didn't go to journalism school. I was at NYU Film School when I met Tate. And I remember having an exercise on filming shadows. It was a light exercise, and Tate was on the train with me at 10 o'clock at night with my little 16 millimeter camera, helping me to carry this equipment as I did this exercise, right? When I did my first film, I Am Ali, that Arthur Jaffa shot, he introduced me to Ingenue Ellis. He's like, I think I know the perfect person for your film. And it was Ingenue, right? Ingenue was a young and not well-known actor at the time. And Tate is always ahead of the curve in that way. He always is spotting talent, knowing what's next. I think about how intergenerational he was, how his relationship with his parents and his older sister Jeree was just as important to him as someone who's 15, 20 years younger than him. So I don't know, I think that kind of expansiveness, that curiosity, that multi-hyphenate, all of that, we have, not because of Tate, there were others who had it before him, but he really showed us how to walk in that path. And I'm so moved by what Joan just said, because, Tate was always on another plane anyway. So if he got some express astral ticket out of here, I believe that, So yeah, I'll end it there.
Thank you, Fresh. The question was for the panelists. What does the culture gain because of what Tate left behind?
Wow, my heart's pounding. It's funny. When he died and I got the phone call, I didn't cry. I had a incredible pain in my stomach that lasted for days. It was like someone was squeezing my chest. And it's kind of because I always saw Greg as this, part of me in a way, because we started together. And to be at the paper and to have that experience of publishing these articles in The Voice at the time all this culture is exploding, this hip hop and punk rock and so much stuff. And so I always saw him as a partner, just in terms of the cultural writing we were doing, and then the evolution. So at a certain point, there's this old saying at a certain point of a rock critic's life that once you get around 30-something, you have to make a decision. Are you going to continue to do this, or are you going to move on? That was always and when Greg got more involved in becoming a creative artist, I thought that's the legacy. The writing's there, but his ability to transform that, to touch people. Burnt Sugar Orchestra, what a fantastic institution that interprets everything from Steely Dan to Miles Davis. So he was able to take his aesthetic, the aesthetic that he started with as a writer, and then make it manifested in art in a different way. And I think that's the thing that really strikes me when I think about him, and it goes hand in hand with all of the different people he's touched. Because you can't build a band, you can't build an orchestra without humanity, without this sense of collaboration, also the sense of guidance, be able to guide people. Not a lot of writers can come out of writing and then become a leader of groups of people. It's kind of antithetical to the writer life. So I think that the ability to transform, I see that as part of his legacy. There's a quote from Dr. Seuss, of all people, that I always like to use. And it says, you can cry about what used to be here, or you can smile because it happened. And so with Greg, I'm smiling because it happened.
Thank you, Nelson.
I'm sorry, can you say the question again?
It's all good. It's all good. What does the culture gain because of what Tate left behind?
God, there's so many things. Like I see him everywhere. Like there's no Afro punk without Greg Tate. There's no Afro punk. That's not a thing. There's no, when I think about what we gain and what I hope we take away is the incredible power in building community. Because Greg's work wasn't what was on the page, and it wasn't just what he performed. It really is the act of standing out there on Astor Place near the barbershop where people know they're going to see him at some point. And there are people who go there because they need to. There are people in our lives where we are forever connected because of, Shannara, I can't even look at you right now. It was in every fabric. It was not just through the artists that he connected, but to have genuine friendships with Greg's mother, who has now passed away. Like Florence Tate had friendships with Greg's friends that had absolutely nothing to do with him at all. To look at Shannara sitting there as this grown, beautiful woman who I love independently of her dad. I thank him for giving you to me, but independently, that I just have never met anyone who has, so many of us are so covetous of what other people have, or so stingy with our ability, like we know this person, so we don't want this person to have this connection. So many of us hoard that. And Greg was the antithesis of that, and that is the reason that this panel can sit here in the way that it does. I'm gonna give you a joke because I need to lighten this up a little bit, but at a party that Greg did for his mother, Florence Tate, in Harlem, legendary party, right? A dear friend of ours, also another writer, Nicole Moore, because she has no couth, gets up, and we're all saying these things about Ma Tate, and she says, okay, let's just let the cat out the bag. Raise your hand if you're
You dated
here and
Tate.
you're an ex of Greg
Tate,
Tate.
yep.
And there's a count off. 1, 2, 3, 4. And here's the thing, we're all the best of friends. They are the first people I called after Dream called me.
Yep.
And how many people can say that they build community like that?
One of one.
One of one. So it was in every fiber of its being. It just who he was. And you know, Tate and I fought, he and Dream fought. It was part of being it was part of being who he was, but I think he even loved that. Like, I always got a sense sometimes that he was really tickled, the more I was worked up about the argument. And I'm very happy about the things he was right about and I was wrong about. And one of them is that I absolutely should be a writer.
We give thanks.
Joan and I had breakfast that morning. And she called me a half hour later, and I was wondering what the hell could have happened in a half hour. And I say that because, and I want to riff a little bit off of what Nelson was saying. It was like, for a moment, time had stopped and you had to process. I was actually on a documentary set and kind of had to quickly gather myself in that moment. And in some ways it became, what gets channeled from me in that moment is almost what would Greg say, right, as kind of an immediate tribute. Joan and I have raised an intellectual child who's one of her besties now and was my most important graduate student, Treva Lindsay. And Treva uses this term, she talks about critical generosity. And that's what Tate did. Someone had mentioned in an earlier panel about that cult nat meets the freaky deek, right? And he talks about the griot, right? And the price that the griot pays for its truth, for their truth telling, is they don't get to be buried with the community. And Tate's truth telling was an act of love, right? Because the whole intent of it was to make all of us better, to make the culture better, right? Those of you who ever interacted, Greg, on Facebook,
A problem.
and watching him hold court, and how Mama Tate would lay in the cut and figure out who to follow because she wouldn't follow anybody unless she knew that they loved her son. And then she became their friend too within that context. Folks who couldn't figure out what Facebook was supposed to be, he would knock out these 700-word pieces and then find some other stuff out there and put it on his page and begin a whole salon conversation about somebody else's Facebook. Who does that? Right? We all spend a bunch of time on social media pushing our brands. This book, this movie, this song, this is who I was with. Greg never did none of that shit. It was always about, what can I talk about today that matters in the culture, right? And, it's irreplaceable, right? But he left us space to fill the gap.
Indeed. Thank you all. Y'all could clap it up one time. I knew I made it in the lexicon of Tate when I went to Mama Tate's birthday party. And I was like, yo, I gotta be one of the youngest people here, but I made it. Like, I went there with some fried green apples for Mama Tate, because that's what you're supposed to do when you're from down south. And I was like I literally still have the screenshot when she started following me on Facebook. I was like, yo, Tate, you cool, you my man, 50 grand, your mom's is where it's at. And as we wrap up this panel, I remember when Dream called me and gave me the news as well. And the first thing I thought of after I cried hysterically was, now Tate is giving me more work, just like Tate. So we created a living archive called GregTateWasLove.com that everybody can go to. But I want to leave us all with this piece, because in similar Tate fashion, he called it even before he transitioned.
Love and the Enemy, Greg Tate, 1991, The Village Voice. I realized that the meaning of being black is summed up in who comes to bury you, who gathers together in your name after you're gone, what they have to say about how you've loved and how you were loved in return. If you can all stand on your feet and clap it up for the great Greg Tate one time. Thank y'all for the space.